I'm now offering consultation services through Faithfully Engaged. If you're struggling finding a church, dealing with a destructive habit such as pornography, trying to find a way to homeschool your kids but don't know where to start, come check me out. Go to faithfullyengaged.com/consulting to learn more information and to see how we can get started. Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Faithfully Engaged. So today I am super excited to have back on the show Dr. Mark McNear. I was doing this with another interview. I believe that you are my third person to be on the show twice. I
Okay.
only have a very select few that have
I
been
feel
back.
good about that. I definitely feel good about that.
Yes. So it's always fun to get to see a familiar face. And today, I have a very exciting announcement that Dr. Mark was so very kind to give us a giveaway. So I actually have two copies here. Try to get it here in screen. Two copies of his book, Finding My Words: A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And I have included in the link, wherever you're watching this, a sign up for my Substack, which is my email list. And I'm giving these two copies away to two random members on there. So if you've not already signed up for that, go ahead and do so. And I will announce that not this week's episode, but the following one on Friday. For those of you that have been watching know that I've been doing solo episodes on Fridays. So I'll give you about a week and a half to sign up, and then I'll announce it on that following Faithful Friday there. So all that being said, Dr. Mark McNear, it's great to have you back on.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you.
Great. Well, I know that last time that we talked, we went through a lot of your book and kind of just the trauma you experienced and also your work as a therapist of working through trauma. So tell us a little bit today of kind of some of these follow-ups that we wanted to talk about of how we respond once we really start getting into trauma work. That's a lot of tough work.
It is, and I am so excited to be doing it. I mean, we were talking before we went on just about how busy our practices are, and so, like we said, it's not great for society, but it's great that we can meet the needs of other people, and so, yeah, my work has gone now toward working primarily with people who have been traumatized, people who have had abuse, had substance issues, had addictions in other areas, process addictions. And so, one of the things that, and I'm going to be real honest with your audience, one of the things that drives me crazy is, is that, a lot of times people don't understand trauma work. And especially when we bring our faith into it. And I had noted to you that I had recently put something up on social media that talked about the fact that there's so much in the aftermath of traumas, issues of anxiety, issues of depression, issues of flashbacks, body reactions, things like that. And I had shared with you, that somebody had responded, and I'm sure they meant really well with it, but they responded and they said, if you would let the Holy Spirit touch you, all of that would go away. And it's a real passion of mine to help people who have had a lot of issues with trauma. But, that type of teaching, it is just unhealthy and unhelpful to people, because people who have had trauma carry so much shame with them. What's the matter with me? And so putting that on them and thinking that, what's the, Johnny, what's the matter with me? I have opened up to the Holy Spirit. I have asked Christ into my life. I am walking with the Lord, and still I'm struggling with all of these trauma reactions, or, I'm struggling with depression or anxiety or flashbacks, or I'm struggling with anger. I'm struggling with addictions. What's the matter with me? And I would say, there's nothing the matter with you. If you got hit by a car, you would have injuries, and you would need treatment for those. And the same thing is true. We're called as believers to bear one another's burdens. And so, I want to just be effective in doing that. I know you want to be effective in doing that. And so, understanding trauma better helps people not to carry the shame, not to carry the guilt of, what's the matter with me. And also it helps us, not to be so quick to give advice to others,
Hmm.
but to just be able to sit with people and sit with their pain and hear what their pain has to say.
I really want to harken a little bit more on that last point there. Something that talk often on here with just the audience that look, I hope anyways that if you're listening to this that you haven't experienced any type of traumatic past. Truly, I pray that most of you have not. But the reality is that if you have not experienced it yourself, you either knowingly or unknowingly know somebody that has. That is about a guarantee that somebody around you has, and you may not know it, but you will run into this at some point. And what you just said there, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding for anybody, but particularly in the church, because we know about God's grace, we know about the Holy Spirit, we know about the gift of salvation, all these great things that we should be talking about. But you ended there of not rushing to give that advice and to be able to listen, to hear, to understand. Why is that so important for people listening to somebody's trauma or pain that they're having and not rushing to just give advice all of a sudden?
Peter Levine, one of the experts in trauma, and he does a lot with the body and body work, says that trauma is not what happened to us, but what we hold inside is in the absence of an empathetic witness. And so people who have had trauma and are carrying it around most likely have not had somebody come alongside them when that was going on. But it's the good news, it's not too late. In that we can come alongside others and bear witness to their pain, bear witness to what they have gone through, without judgment, without shame, just hearing what the person has to say. And I think that Jesus was such a great model with that, of course, in the way that he heard stories of other people, and moved into their stories. And so, I think at times in my own life I have struggled with this, especially as a practitioner early on, feeling anxious and wanting to rescue people out of their pain instead of just allowing people to share the pain and for me to sit there in it, not giving advice, not telling them what they need to do, but just connecting with them on a deeper level and hearing what they have to say and hearing the suffering that they have gone through. So I think it's so important. I think Peter Levine hits the nail on the head when he talks about, that empathetic witness, that person that comes alongside and listens to the other person. And I think that's part of our job, right? That's what we do, is hopefully we're really good listeners. And so I want to encourage the audience to, you can't really listen when you're preparing what you're going to say next, but if you're listening and really connecting with the individual and not having expectations of needing to fix them, not having expectations of what you're going to say next, but just sitting there, it's powerful. That attunement is really powerful for individuals.
It's interesting. I'm thinking of a conversation I've had with my wife, and it being very similar to something that my pastors actually talked about. That when I'm talking about my wife, sometimes she'll ask me questions not about like specific clients, this confidentiality things, but like, hey, what do you do? Like, what does that look like? And I tell her that a good chunk of what I do is listen, just hear what they say, reflect back what they're saying, ask good questions. Like, of course, there may be sometimes I'll suggest something here and there, but listening is so powerful. And I'm sure you've experienced this too, that sessions where you do such a majority of listening and they walk out and like, oh man, I feel so much better. Somebody was there with me. And my pastor was saying something in a very different context, but was talking about, this was more of like an evangelism type of thing. But there's actually a lot of similarities there. that I can't remember who he was speaking of. There's somebody, some evangelist or somebody he was talking about, and he was saying that that person probably 75% of what they do is listen and ask questions. So
Mhm.
even when you're sharing the gospel, being able to hear where they're coming from, asking them good questions. Well, why do you feel this way? What's going on here? Even with the gospel, that's a good idea. So
Yeah.
it's I find that God's truth, it permeates in everything. So it's yes, it works in the trauma side. We as Christians may need to sit back and look at, even with our evangelism and things of that nature, are we just saying stuff just so we're the good guys, or are we actually seeking people's hearts out? Because those are
Right.
two different things.
Yeah. Are we looking for results, or are we attuning to the individual and hearing what they have to say?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have an agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying, specifically for somebody that's been experiencing some type of deep trauma, I would love for you to speak a little bit more into of the difference between somebody that had a really bad situation that happened, but they had supportive, loving environment around them. There were people to walk with them, as opposed to the lonely sufferer, somebody that's all by themselves. Why
Yeah.
do they have such different outcomes if they don't really have that support?
Johnny. That's such a great question. I look at the research that's been done, and they have done research with people that go to war, and a lot of people during wartime have suffered from addiction when they're there. Okay, they come home, and there has been a noticeable difference. There's a certain percentage of the population that just lets go of the addictions, and then there's another percentage of individuals who hold dearly onto the addiction and have a hard time letting go. The difference is their childhood, how they were raised, and whether they had stability or whether they had a lot of trauma and a lot of dysregulation in their childhood. And so I think that's across the board. When we have people to connect with us, we fare much greater than when we're, as you said, the lone sufferer. The person that's alone, that has had nobody to talk to. With addiction, we look at isolation as being such a toxic thing, but I don't think it's something that's new for the person that's in addiction. It compounds it, but it's something that I think the person is already used to because of having that background where they were isolated, or they didn't connect, or weren't connected to, I should say, by others, their parents, siblings, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks highly to God's design as well, that we are social creatures. We're meant to have a loving, stable family around us, and it doesn't protect us from everything. But that's so fascinating that you go to war and come back, and that's such a tying factor is your childhood. That speaks so highly to that. And when somebody doesn't have that, they've had a very dysregulated childhood,
Yeah.
can certainly
Yeah.
cause more of those issues.
So many times I've heard people say, the past is the past. But when you think about it with trauma, one of the things I stress in my book is the past is not the past when it shows up in the present.
Mhm.
That's one thing. And the other thing is, William Faulkner talked about the fact that there's no such thing as the past. The past is always here because we take it with us. We can't erase it.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that we were again talking about before getting on was that idea that Bessel van der Kolk talks about, the fact that trauma comes back as a reaction and not a memory.
Mhm.
And so I see that so much with individuals. I see it in my own life with the trauma that I've had, but I also see it in individuals' life. And I was telling you a little case story of somebody I got the permission to share this story. A woman was telling me that she had a weekend where she was around this woman, an older woman, and she said that they went to a carnival and they went with family, and so it was a really nice time. But she felt uncomfortable the whole time. really, really uncomfortable. And she felt bad because she said that, she looked at this lady. This lady was really nice, but she didn't like her. She just had this instinct, this wall that came up that she didn't like her. And as it was explored, she had said that after the weekend, she really thought about it, and she like realized the woman was wearing the same perfume that her mother wore, and her mother was very, very abusive to her
Mm.
in so many ways. So that's, as a therapist, being a good detective and being able to look at the clues and not just looking at the face value of something is really important. And I want listeners to hear that it's really important when we've all had that experience where we are around somebody that we feel really uncomfortable being around, and then often we'll shame ourselves and say, like, what's the matter with me? Why am I like this? But there's reasons for it.
Mhm.
And that's a good example of the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. Something
Yeah.
simple like perfume is profound, you know?
And just on a personal notes, not on the necessarily as on the trauma side, but just to show the importance of the senses in that way and how it ties memories, how we feel in the present like that. I had this ended up being more of a positive than a negative,
Hmm.
but similar thing that being in Walmart, and it was perfume. Smelled someone's perfume and like, whoa, what is this? And bam, immediately was thinking of my grandma who wore the same
Mm-hmm.
perfume. Now, thankfully for me, that was more of that positive memory. But that makes me think as a therapist when
Mm-hmm.
I hear somebody and they think of their grandma and that was a very negative thing.
Yeah.
That those senses tie you right back there, but the trauma is making that into a negative reaction there. That
Yeah, what is
right
it?
there
What
in the
is it
moment.
connected to? What is that smell connected to? Or what is that location connected to? What is that weather connected to?
Mhm.
Sometimes people will say to me, like, when the fall comes, I struggle so much. And it'll end up being that that's when some abuse started, like sexual abuse or physical abuse started, and so things like that are so common, but they're not obvious,
Mhm.
until
Yeah,
they're explored.
that's a really good way you put that. They're common, but they're not obvious, and that's something you and I do in counseling work is to I love how you put that detective work, asking those
Yeah.
questions and trying to poke around a little bit. But for that individual, they just felt bad. I don't know
Hmm.
what's going on. And
Right.
that's why it's so important to explore these things. And that kind of leads me into this next question that I know a lot of times, I can even be disheartened at times when I see a client where, like, I see them once or twice and there's a lot of more work to be done. And then they
Hmm.
just kind of fizzle out. Maybe they get
Yeah.
cold feet or something for maybe some of the people listening, that maybe they've done that themselves or they know somebody like that,
Hmm.
that needs that ongoing treatment. What's some encouragement for somebody that's experienced this trauma and they just need that ongoing trauma treatment? Like, what can they do in those situations?
Well, I think it's important to realize it gets worse before it gets better,
Hmm.
and so sometimes, and I can tell you in my own life, it got much worse before it got better because, I had done so much with addictions to cover up the pain, that when I had to start dealing with memories, traumatic memories of things that happened to me, and I started feeling them in my body, I just wanted to run away.
Hmm.
So I think one thing that's really helpful to consider, Rothschild talks about applying the brakes. And she's a therapist, a trauma therapist. And what she means by that is for the client not to rush into things. I can remember, Johnny, when I was in right after rehab, I was in counseling with a guy who was really trauma informed, and we started delving into some of these really, really painful memories. And one of the things that I did when it got to be too much is I would just put my hand up,
Hmm.
and that was my way of saying, like, enough. Don't want to go any further with this memory. And so, being trauma informed to take it really slow with individuals. We get so excited and we want to go, but we need to go at the pace of the person. And I think one thing that people share with me all the time, they'll come in and they'll be like, I am so anxious. I want to talk about these things, but my body is telling me no. And so usually what I'll do with them is I'll work on regulation with them. We'll work on tapping, or we'll work on breathing. We'll work on, because we don't want to rush into these stories without proper care to the body. And so sometimes, and I've done this a million times, and I guess with experience now, I don't do it as much. But there's that desire of wanting to rush in, instead of taking it really slow and saying we need to care for your body, and we don't want to overwhelm the system. So I know Bessel van der Kolk, with The Body Keeps a Score, he talks about, throwing a beach ball back and forth in a session to help somebody to regulate and connect. So getting creative with things, finding ways to relax the body. I had a woman this week who was talking about a very, very difficult story, overwhelming. And she had written out maybe 3 paragraphs. And I had said to her, even if we get to 2 sentences, if we stay regulated, we're doing really good work. So I think that, setting up safety plans beforehand, like me putting my hand up, saying that's enough, can't do any more today. And sometimes that was after 15 minutes. But that allowed me to build a foundation where I could go forward and talk about more things.
Yeah, absolutely. And this leads in well. And I think there's a lot of principles that can be taken from that, of being on, okay, instead of being the more of the person that has experienced the trauma, maybe the family member, trying to help support. What can they be doing aside from, just listening and things of that nature? Is there anything else that family members can do to help somebody that's experienced this trauma, and they're struggling, and you want to help? Is there anything else you would recommend for family members to do to help?
I think finding ways to regulate themselves, regulate their own bodies, things like that. The last thing that we want to do as therapists is traumatize the client or re-traumatize the client by talking about things prematurely. So I think even education for family members to know not to rush in, not to shame, not to dive in, wait for the person to talk about these things. It's hard to do because we want to see loved ones get better, but it does take a lot of time. I remember, Johnny, when I was in rehab, I had a really wise physician. And he said to me, you've been through a lot, and it's going to take you about 10 years. And I was like, what? 10 years? But I'm coming up on my 10th year, and I could see the wisdom in that statement, that it really took time for me to be able to integrate these things that happened to me when I was so young. And so I want listeners to hear that it's not like, you go into treatment. I don't want family members to think this, you go into treatment and, a few months and everything's fine. It takes time when there's been this much damage.
With you saying those things, as far as just not rushing in, both as the person experiencing trauma and as the family member, it really harkens back on the faith side that, look, God is the one that's in control. And there's times that we don't understand that. There's times that we don't know why things are going on, and it's hard. And that's fine to have that understanding. But it's showing that faith in God, that when I have to be patient towards my recovery, patient towards my family members' recovery, I'm not the one 1000% in control. I need that trust and reliance on God through that, instead of just me pressing this easy button and it just goes away. And I'm interested to hear from you as well, like bringing the faith component into this. How can, especially with a loved one that's hurting and hates to see their loved ones struggling like this, how can their faith in God help them through this process?
That's a great question, Johnny. I look at it, and I can tell you from my own life with my wife Debbie, with my daughter Emily, my son-in-law Brandon, they were extremely patient and watched it unfold. I think that my wife is someone who has a great faith in Jesus. And looked at it and said, what, this is Mark's journey. It's her journey too, but it's Mark's journey. And I felt the freedom to be able to. I'm really motivated and wanted to get better, but it does take time, and it's so frustrating. And so it wasn't overnight. And so, God looks at us, and He's looking at us in light of eternity. And it's not this quick microwave mentality of, quick. We've got to get it done quick. He is in the process of sanctifying us. I think of Philippians 1:6, and this is a verse that if I said it once, I said it a million times in the last 10 years. Be confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you, he will continue it until the day of Christ Jesus. And so I think that's a great verse for family members, and I think it's also a great verse for the person who is really dealing with trauma or addiction and in recovery. It takes time. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of treatment. It takes a lot of frustration tolerance, building a frustration tolerance, and being able to just widen that window of tolerance to be able to tolerate feelings in my body that I've never been able to tolerate before. So as long as you think it's going to take, probably multiply that. I know that can be discouraging for people, but I want to be realistic. God is a kind God. I love the verse in Romans 2:4. It's the kindness of God that leads to change. And it's something that we really, really hold on to. Hebrews 4:15 talks about that we don't have a savior that doesn't know what we're going through, a high priest. He's been through all of it and more, and has come out on the other side. So we can rely on him. We can tell him anything that we're feeling. We can invite him into these messy stories, and he's the one that restores. It's not us, it's him that brings the restoration.
I think that is wonderfully said, and it puts things in perspective. It's not all on me to fix every little thing in the world. I need to have that confidence in God that he's got it, he's in control, and he's got it even when I have doubts and concerns along the way. He can still take it. And I think that's really important, whether you're the one suffering or the family member suffering alongside, to keep all of that in mind.
Yeah.
Well, I am, again, super glad that you were able to come back on. I know we really just scratched the surface. We can talk about trauma for years and years. So people that are listening to this, and maybe they're interested in getting your book, or just want to know more about you, be in contact with you, how can people be in contact with you and maybe get the book?
Sure. They can go on Google and just put in www.markmcnear.com, and my website will come up. Johnny, there's a place there where they can email me. And then if they want the book, it's Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma, and that's on Amazon. So love for people to reach out and read it.
Fantastic. And I will remind you all again, please sign up for my Substack link that's down in the description, and two of you will be able to actually win the book. And definitely, if you're not a winner, or even if you are a winner, think about purchasing the book. I've read it myself. I've described it as an easy read, very much in the quotation marks of physically being able to read the book. Like the words themselves, but the actual processing of it is deep, heavy stuff. So it's a very slow read in that way, to take your time. And definitely, if you're somebody that's experienced trauma, just beware that it is a very deep, heavy book, but it is very well written. So I highly recommend it to anybody that's listening to this. Right. Well, Dr. Mark McNear, again, great to have you on. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Johnny. Great being with you.
You bet. And thank you to all that were tuning in today. And we will catch you on the next episode.